The ocean's depths hold more than shipwrecks and lost treasure. Beneath the waves, submarines carry the world's most closely guarded secrets: nuclear launch codes, espionage operations, experimental weapons technology, and intelligence that could shift the balance of global power. These vessels operate in absolute darkness, their missions classified, their movements tracked only by the most sophisticated surveillance systems. When submarines surface unexpectedly, sink in hostile waters, or are captured by foreign powers, governments face a crisis that transcends maritime disaster. The question becomes not just what happened, but what was aboard. What did they find? And why must it remain classified decades later? These aren't just mechanical failures or tragic accidents documented by coast guards and investigated by maritime authorities. These are national security crises that trigger immediate government intervention. Teams of intelligence officers arrive before rescue operations complete. Documents are seized from families before bodies are recovered. Photographs are classified before investigators finish examining them. Official reports cite vague causes, while the evidence that might explain the truth disappears into locked archives stamped top secret. Modern technology, satellite tracking, and international maritime law haven't stopped governments from hiding what happens when submarines fail. If anything, they've made these disappearances more puzzling. The pattern repeats across decades and nations. American nuclear submarines vanish with all hands, and the Navy classifies the wreck photographs. Soviet ballistic missile boats sink with their nuclear arsenals, and the Kremlin seals the investigation. British submarines flood at the pier, and the Admiralty invokes the Official Secrets Act. French submarines disappear in the Mediterranean, and the government refuses to disclose findings even after the wreck is found 51 years later. The Cold War amplified this secrecy, but the pattern existed before and continues after. Every submarine carries secrets that outlive the men who sail her. From the Cold War depths, where nuclear submarines vanished with all their secrets, to modern incidents where recovered vessels yield documents immediately locked away. The machinery of classification operates with ruthless efficiency. Official reports cite mechanical failure or human error, but the seized evidence tells a different story, one that governments insist the public can never read. Families demand answers and receive silence. Investigators find evidence and watch it disappear into vaults. Decades pass, and freedom of information requests are denied. These are the submarine mysteries, where what was found matters more than what was lost. The ocean keeps some secrets, but governments keep more. The USS Scorpion, May 22, 1968. The Atlantic Ocean, approximately 400 nautical miles southwest of the Azores. The nuclear-powered attack submarine carrying 19 souls and an arsenal of classified weapon systems fails to report for scheduled communication. The silence triggers the largest peacetime submarine search in U.S. Navy history. Commander Francis Atwood Slattery, 36 years old, had commanded the Scorpion since August 1967. A 1950 graduate of the Naval Academy, Slattery had risen through the submarine service during the height of the Cold War, earning respect for his technical competence and steady command presence. His wife Jane waited with their 4 children at their Norfolk home, expecting the submarine to arrive at Naval Station Norfolk on May 27th as scheduled. The Scorpion had been operating in the Mediterranean, conducting surveillance operations, the exact nature of which remained classified even after the submarine's disappearance. The Scorpion was a skipjack-class nuclear attack submarine, launched on December 19, 1959, at the Electric Boat Division of General Dynamics in Groton, Connecticut. At 252 feet in length and displacing 3,070 tons when surfaced, she represented the Navy's first production class of nuclear submarines designed for high speed. The skipjack class could achieve speeds exceeding 30 knots submerged, making them among the fastest submarines in the world. The Scorpion's armament included Mark 37 torpedoes and Mark 45 nuclear-tipped Astor torpedoes, weapon systems whose presence aboard the submarine would complicate every aspect of the investigation that followed. The timeline of the Scorpion's final days reveals a vessel operating under unusual circumstances. On May 17, 1968, the submarine departed Rota, Spain, bound for Norfolk, Virginia. The crew had been at sea for 3 months, and morale was high as the men anticipated returning home. Lieutenant Commander Robert Fountain, the executive officer, had conducted the standard pre-deployment inspections and found no significant mechanical problems. The submarine's nuclear reactor was operating normally, her weapon systems were secured for transit, and her navigation equipment functioned properly. May 21, 1968, at approximately 12:00 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time. The Scorpion transmits her last confirmed radio message, reporting her position as south of the Azores and confirming her expected arrival at Norfolk on May 27th. The transmission is routine, professional, and gives no indication of any problems aboard the submarine. Radio operators at Naval Station Rota acknowledge the message and note the submarine's position in the communication log. It is the last time anyone outside the Scorpion will hear from Commander Slattery or his crew. May 27, 1968. The Scorpion fails to arrive at Norfolk as scheduled. Wives and children gather at the pier, scanning the horizon for the submarine's distinctive black sail breaking the surface. By late afternoon, Navy officials acknowledge that the submarine is overdue and begin making discreet inquiries about her last known position. By evening, the families are escorted from the pier and told that search operations are beginning. The official statement cites communications difficulties and suggests the submarine may have experienced mechanical problems requiring surface transit. The search operation expands rapidly as the Navy mobilizes resources across the Atlantic. The oceanographic research ship USNS Mizar, equipped with deep-sea cameras and side-scan sonar, begins systematic searches of the area where the Scorpion should have been transiting. Surface ships crisscross thousands of square miles of ocean, while patrol aircraft fly search patterns from the Azores to the American coast. The Navy's Sound Surveillance System, or SOSUS, is quietly analyzed for any acoustic signatures that might indicate the submarine's fate. October 30th, 1968. 5 months after the Scorpion's disappearance, the Mizar's cameras photograph wreckage on the ocean floor at a depth of more than 10,000 feet. The images show the submarine's hull broken into several major sections, the sail structure separated from the main hull, and debris scattered across the seabed. The immediate response from Navy leadership is to classify the photographs top secret and restrict all information about the wreck's condition to personnel with the highest security clearances. Evidence methodically presented to the Navy Court of Inquiry painted a picture of catastrophic failure. The wreck photographs showed that the Scorpion had imploded, her pressure hull crushed by the immense forces at depth. The submarine's reactor compartment appeared relatively intact, a critical finding given concerns about radiation contamination. The torpedo room showed significant damage, and the condition of the weapons aboard became a matter of immediate classified concern. Navy divers would not visit the wreck. At 10,000 feet, the depth exceeded safe diving limits, and authorities decided that the risks of disturbing the wreck outweighed the benefits of direct examination. The competing theories about the Scorpion's loss emerged as investigators struggled to explain why a modern nuclear submarine simply vanished. The first theory focused on internal torpedo explosion. Investigators noted that the Mark 37 torpedo used a hydrogen peroxide-fueled propulsion system known for instability. If a torpedo's battery or motor had malfunctioned, the resulting fire or explosion could have flooded the torpedo room, causing the submarine to lose buoyancy and sink beyond crush depth. This theory gained support from acoustic analysis, suggesting multiple pressure hull failure events consistent with progressive flooding and implosion. A second theory examined the possibility of Soviet involvement. The Scorpion had been conducting classified surveillance operations against Soviet naval forces in the Mediterranean. Naval intelligence knew that Soviet submarines regularly tracked American boats, and the possibility of collision or deliberate attack could not be dismissed. Some investigators suggested that a Soviet submarine might have engaged the Scorpion with torpedoes, while others proposed that a collision during close-quarters surveillance had caused fatal damage. The evidence supporting this theory was immediately classified, and speculation about Soviet involvement was officially discouraged. The third theory considered structural failure unrelated to weapon systems or foreign attack. The Scorpion had recently completed a brief overhaul period, but several maintenance items had been deferred due to time and budget constraints. The submarine's trash disposal unit had been malfunctioning, and there were concerns about a valve in the engine room. Some investigators suggested that progressive flooding through a failed valve or hull penetration could have overwhelmed the crew's damage control efforts. The submarine's age and operational tempo made mechanical failure a plausible explanation. The investigation revealed troubling gaps in the official record. Navy's acoustic data from SOSA stations had detected sounds consistent with submarine hull collapse on May 22nd at approximately 6:59 p.m. GMT, providing a precise time and location for the disaster. However, this information was classified top secret and not disclosed to the families or the public for years. The acoustic signature suggested that the Scorpion had suffered multiple hull failures, creating sounds that analysts could distinguish from natural phenomena or surface ship activity. The Court of Inquiry convened to investigate the loss, heard testimony from submarine design experts, torpedo specialists, and intelligence officers. Much of this testimony was immediately classified. The public portions of the inquiry focused on possible mechanical failures and maintenance issues, carefully avoiding any discussion of the submarine's classified mission or the weapon systems aboard. The families of the 99 missing men were given minimal information, told only that the submarine had been lost with all hands and that the exact cause remained undetermined. Expert witnesses testified about the skipjack-class design and its known vulnerabilities. The class had experienced several incidents involving propulsion system failures and control surface problems. Some submarines had suffered fires in electrical systems, while others had reported difficulties with diving plane mechanisms. However, none of these known issues fully explained why the Scorpion would have sunk so catastrophically that no distress signal was transmitted and no emergency communications buoy was released. The aftermath of the investigation led to immediate changes in submarine safety procedures, but the details of these changes were classified. The Navy implemented new requirements for weapons handling, revised its procedures for monitoring submarine communications, and modified the design of future attack submarines. However, the specific failures that these changes addressed were never disclosed publicly, leaving families and the public to speculate about what the Navy had learned from examining the Scorpion's wreck. The families of the 99 men who died aboard the Scorpion organized to demand answers from the Navy. Led by the wives of several crew members, they petitioned for access to the Court of Inquiry transcripts and wreck photographs. The Navy denied these requests, citing national security concerns related to nuclear propulsion systems and classified weapons. The families were told that full disclosure might compromise submarine technology and operational procedures still in use by the fleet. Decades passed, and the classification remained in place. Freedom of Information Act requests, filed in the 1980s and 1990s, yielded only heavily redacted documents that raised more questions than they answered. The Navy released some basic information about the wreck's location and confirmed that acoustic data had detected the submarine's loss, but the critical evidence about what caused the disaster stayed locked in classified files. The photographs showing the wreck's condition, the analysis of torpedo damage, and the intelligence assessments about possible Soviet involvement all remained stamped top secret. The legacy of the USS Scorpion extends far beyond the immediate tragedy to encompass broader questions about government transparency and military accountability. The 99 men who vanished with the submarine became casualties not just of submarine warfare, but of a classification system that prioritizes institutional secrecy over families' right to know how their loved ones died. Commander Slattery, Lieutenant Commander Fountain, and 97 crew members left behind wives, children, and parents who had spent decades fighting for answers that authorities insisted must remain hidden. Recent attempts to declassify Scorpion documents have yielded minimal results. A 2017 Navy review concluded that most materials related to the submarine's loss still require classification protection due to information about nuclear propulsion systems and weapons technology. The wreck photographs remain classified more than 55 years after they were taken, their contents known only to cleared personnel and investigators. The acoustic data that pinpointed the moment of the submarine's destruction has been partially released, but critical analysis supporting various theories about the cause remains sealed. The Scorpion rests today on the Atlantic seabed at 32 degrees 55 minutes north latitude, 33 degrees 09 minutes west longitude. Her nuclear reactor secured and monitored by periodic Navy surveys. The submarine herself has become a classified site, with the Navy restricting information about her exact condition and the environmental monitoring conducted around the wreck. The 99 souls who died aboard her remain entombed in a steel coffin that authorities refuse to fully examine or explain. Their sacrifice honored publicly, while the truth about their deaths stays locked in government vaults that may never open, Soviet submarine K-129. March 8, 1968. The Pacific Ocean, 1,560 nautical miles northwest of Hawaii, the Gulf II class ballistic missile submarine sinks catastrophically in 16,000 feet of water, carrying 98 crew members, 3 R-21 nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles, and the Soviet Navy's most sensitive encryption systems. The United States knows within hours what follows will become the most audacious and classified salvage operation in history. The discovery came not from surface search or distress signals, but from the classified hydrophone arrays of the sound surveillance system stretching across the Pacific seabed. At 8:40 a.m. local time on March 8th, SOSUS stations detected acoustic signatures consistent with submarine hull implosion at extreme depth. U.S. Navy analysts triangulated the position to within a few nautical miles and immediately classified the information top secret. The Soviet Northern Fleet began searching for K-129 days later, but searched in the wrong area, hundreds of miles from where American intelligence had already pinpointed the wreck. Captain First Rank Vladimir Ivanovich Kobzar commanded K-129 with a crew composition reflecting standard Soviet submarine operations. The 98 men aboard included experienced officers, conscript sailors serving their mandatory military service, and technical specialists responsible for the ballistic missiles and nuclear warheads. Kobzar had commanded ballistic missile submarines since 1965 and was considered competent by Soviet Pacific Fleet standards. His wife and 3 children in Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky would not learn of his death for weeks, and even then would receive only the minimal information the Soviet authorities provided to families of lost submariners. K-129 was a Project 629A submarine, designated Gulf II by NATO intelligence. Built at the Komsomolsk-on-Amur shipyard and commissioned in 1960, the diesel-electric submarine displaced 2,350 tons surfaced and carried 3 R-21 ballistic missiles in vertical launch tubes housed in the sail structure. Each R-21 missile could deliver a nuclear warhead with a range of 870 nautical miles, making K-129 a strategic asset in Soviet naval planning. The submarine's encryption equipment included sophisticated cipher machines the Soviet authorities considered among their most valuable secrets. The timeline of K-129's final patrol began on February 24, 1968, when the submarine departed Rizak Bay Naval Base for what should have been a routine 70-day strategic deterrent patrol in the North Pacific. Soviet doctrine called for Gulf-class submarines to patrol areas within missile range of American targets, providing a second strike capability in the event of nuclear war. K-129's assigned patrol area was northeast of Hawaii, a position that would allow her missiles to reach West Coast targets if war came. American intelligence monitored Soviet submarine departures through multiple classified channels. When K-129 left port, U.S. Navy tracking stations noted her departure and assigned surveillance assets to monitor her transit. This routine Cold War surveillance would prove crucial when the submarine disappeared, providing data that the CIA would later use to locate the wreck with remarkable precision. March 8, 1968. Something catastrophic occurs aboard K-129. The acoustic signature detected by SOSUS indicates rapid hull failure at depth, suggesting that the submarine either flooded while submerged or suffered structural collapse while attempting to surface. The Soviet Pacific Fleet receives no distress transmission, no emergency buoy deployment, and no indication that the submarine experienced any problems. K-129 simply ceases to exist in Soviet operational awareness. The Soviet search operation begins on March 11th, when K-129 fails to make scheduled radio contact. Surface ships and aircraft from the Pacific Fleet search thousands of square miles, but they search in the wrong area. Misled by assumptions about the submarine's patrol route and the range limitations of their own search equipment. American intelligence watches the Soviet search operations through classified surveillance, noting that Soviet ships never approached the area where SOSUS had detected the implosion. By mid-April, the Soviet Union privately admits that K-129 is lost with all hands. Families receive terse notifications citing submarine operational losses without providing details about location or cause. The investigation conducted by Soviet naval intelligence remains classified, with findings shared only among senior military leadership and Communist Party officials. The official conclusion, never publicly disclosed, suggests battery explosion or collision as possible causes, but the evidence supporting these theories is thin and largely speculative. The American response to K-129's loss transcended normal Cold War intelligence gathering. At some point in 1968 or early 1969, the Central Intelligence Agency began planning an operation to recover the Soviet submarine from 16,000 feet of water. The operation, designated Project Azorian, would require technologies that did not yet exist and cover stories elaborate enough to hide the recovery attempt from Soviet surveillance. The decision to attempt recovery was made at the highest levels of the U.S. government, with President Nixon personally approving the operation and its enormous budget. Howard Hughes became the unlikely public face of the recovery operation. The reclusive billionaire's corporate empire was used as cover for building the Hughes Glomar Explorer, a specialized deep-sea salvage vessel designed for a single purpose that could never be publicly acknowledged. The ship's stated mission involved mining manganese nodules from the deep seabed, a cover story that required creating an entire fake business venture to explain why Hughes would invest in such unusual technology. Construction of the Glomar Explorer began in 1971 at Sun Shipbuilding in Chester, Pennsylvania. The vessel stretched 618 feet in length and featured a central moon pool through which the salvage equipment would operate. The ship's centerpiece was a massive mechanical claw called Clementine, designed to grasp the submarine's hull and lift it through 3 miles of ocean. The entire operation was managed by the CIA's Office of Special Activities, with security procedures so tight that most workers building the ship had no idea of its true purpose. July 1974. The Glomar Explorer arrives over K-129's wreck site and begins salvage operations. The recovery attempt proceeds in absolute secrecy, with CIA personnel aboard the ship using the manganese nodule cover story, even with crew members not cleared for the true mission. The mechanical claw descends through 16,000 feet of water, a feat of engineering that pushed the boundaries of deep-sea technology. The salvage operation encountered disaster during the recovery phase. As Clementine lifted the submarine's hull, structural failure caused a large section of the wreck to break away and fall back to the ocean floor. The recovered portion included the forward section of the submarine, containing some crew remains, 2 nuclear torpedoes, code materials, and cryptographic equipment. The section containing the 3 nuclear-tipped R-21 missiles fell back to the seabed beyond recovery. Evidence recovered from K-129 was immediately transported to secure CIA facilities for examination. The cryptographic equipment was sent to the National Security Agency where analysts spent years exploiting Soviet naval codes and cipher systems. The two nuclear torpedoes were examined by weapons specialists from the Department of Energy. 6 crew members' bodies were recovered relatively intact, photographed for identification purposes, and later buried at sea with full military honors in a ceremony filmed by the CIA, but kept classified for decades. The competing theories about what sank K-129 were informed by evidence that American intelligence never shared with Soviet authorities. The first theory, supported by some CIA analysts, suggested that a Soviet missile guidance malfunction caused an explosion in one of the R-21 launch tubes. This theory relied on classified acoustic data and physical evidence from the recovered section. The second theory examined the possibility of battery explosion in the diesel-electric propulsion system, a known vulnerability in Gulf-class submarines. The third theory, which gained credibility from wreckage examination, proposed that the submarine had been operating at or near the surface when catastrophic flooding occurred, possibly due to an open hatch or failed seal. Soviet authorities learned about Project Azorian through a security breach that occurred in 1975. Investigative journalist Jack Anderson disclosed portions of the operation, forcing the CIA to acknowledge that some salvage operation had occurred. The Soviet government immediately demanded return of any recovered materials and crew remains. The CIA refused, citing national security concerns. What exactly was recovered, what intelligence was gained, and what cryptographic secrets were exploited remained classified. The aftermath of K-129's recovery created unusual diplomatic tensions. The Soviet Union could not protest too loudly without acknowledging that they had lost track of one of their ballistic missile submarines. The United States could not explain what they had learned without revealing the success of Project Azorian. Both nations settled into an uncomfortable silence, with each side knowing that the other possessed secrets about the incident, but unable to discuss them openly. Partial declassification came in 2010, when the CIA released some documents about Project Azorian, including acknowledgement that the recovery operation had occurred and that some crew remains had been recovered and buried. The film of the burial ceremony was released to Russian authorities, providing the first visual evidence of what the CIA had found. However, the documents about what cryptographic intelligence was recovered, what Soviet codes were broken, and what strategic advantage the United States gained from examining K-129's weapon systems remained classified. The 98 submariners who died aboard K-129 became casualties of Cold War espionage long after their deaths. Their submarine, which Soviet authorities had written off as lost to mechanical failure, instead became the subject of the most expensive covert operation in CIA history. Captain Kobzar and his crew lie in 2 graves, 6 buried at sea by American intelligence officers, and the rest still entombed in the wreckage on the Pacific floor, surrounded by secrets that both superpowers continue to protect 5 decades later. HMS Affray, April 16, 1951, the English Channel, 30 miles north of Alderney. The Amphion-class submarine carrying 75 men on a training exercise transmits her final position report at 9:15 p.m. Hours later, she fails to surface. The Admiralty Court of Inquiry that follows will raise more questions than it answers and seal the evidence for 50 years. Lieutenant John Blackburn commanded HMS Affray on what should have been a routine training mission. The 32-year-old officer from Portsmouth had joined the Royal Navy in 1937 and served throughout World War II aboard various submarines. His experience made him a natural choice to command a training exercise that included not just regular submarine crew, but also Royal Marine Commandos practicing submarine insertion techniques. Blackburn's wife and 2 young daughters expected him home within days of the exercise's completion. The submarine departed HMS Dolphin at Gosport on April 16th, with a crew significantly larger than normal operations required. The 75 men aboard included the submarine's standard complement of officers and ratings: 4 Royal Marine officers, 14 Marine Commandos, and several additional technical personnel observing the training exercise. This overcrowding was standard practice for training missions, but it would later complicate efforts to determine exactly who was aboard when Affray disappeared. HMS Affray was an Amphion-class submarine launched in 1945 as part of the Royal Navy's late-war submarine construction program. At 281 feet in length and displacing 1,360 tons surfaced, she represented conventional diesel-electric submarine technology refined through years of wartime experience. The Amphion class incorporated several innovations, including the snort mast system, a Dutch invention that allowed submarines to run their diesel engines while remaining submerged by drawing air through a raised mast fitted with valves to prevent water ingress. The training exercise called for Affray to proceed submerged to a position off the Channel Islands, where the Royal Marine Commandos would practice emergency egress procedures. The mission plan required the submarine to surface at regular intervals to report position and status. The final transmission at 9:15 p.m. on April 16th followed this protocol, with the duty radio operator acknowledging Affray's report and noting nothing unusual in the communication. When the submarine failed to make her scheduled 8 a.m. contact on April 17th, concern escalated quickly. The search operation mobilized resources from across the Royal Navy. Surface vessels, aircraft, and other submarines combed the English Channel, focusing initially on Affray's reported position and likely transit routes. The scale of the search reflected both the number of men involved and the presence of Royal Marines among the missing, which elevated the incident's political sensitivity. Families gathered at Gosport, receiving updates that grew increasingly grim as days passed without contact. June 14th, 1951. Nearly 2 months after Affray's disappearance, the submarine is located in 278 feet of water, approximately 30 miles from her last reported position. The delay in finding the wreck reflected both the limitations of 1951 search technology and the difficulty of locating a submarine on the seabed in the busy shipping lanes of the English Channel. When divers finally examined the wreck, they found the submarine resting upright with her snort mast raised, suggesting she had been attempting to run submerged on diesel power when disaster struck. Physical evidence from the wreck showed that the snort mast's upper valve had failed, allowing seawater to flood into the submarine through the snorkel system. This failure would have caused rapid flooding of the engine room and adjacent compartments, overwhelming the crew's ability to surface or seal off the damaged areas. The submarine's batteries, exposed to seawater, would have generated deadly chlorine gas, creating conditions where survival became impossible within minutes. The Admiralty Court of Inquiry opened at Gosport in July 1951 to determine the cause of Affray's loss. The inquiry heard testimony from submarine design specialists, former Affray crew members who had not been aboard for the fatal exercise, and technical experts on snort mask systems. The testimony revealed that snort mask valves had experienced problems on several submarines, but the Admiralty had not implemented comprehensive fixes across the fleet. This information was considered embarrassing to naval leadership and potentially damaging to public confidence in submarine safety. The competing theories examined by the inquiry focused primarily on the snort mask failure, but alternate explanations were also considered. Some witnesses suggested that battery explosion might have occurred independently of flooding, creating toxic gas that killed the crew before the submarine could surface. Others proposed that a collision with a surface vessel or underwater object might have damaged the hull, causing flooding that coincided with but was not caused by snort mask failure. The evidence supporting these alternative theories was documented but then restricted under the Official Secrets Act. The Court of Inquiry reached its official conclusion in late 1951. HMS Affray was lost due to snort mask valve failure, causing catastrophic flooding. The inquiry made recommendations for improved valve designs and maintenance procedures, but stopped short of assigning blame to individuals or acknowledging systemic failures in submarine safety oversight. The full transcript of the proceedings was classified, with only a brief summary released to the public and families. Families of the 75 missing men received minimal information about the inquiry's findings. The Official Secrets Act prevented discussion of technical details, maintenance records, and testimonies suggesting that Affray's loss might have been preventable. Parents and widows who demanded fuller explanations were told that national security interests required continued classification of the evidence. The frustration of families denied closure would persist for decades. The British government's classification of Affray documents extended beyond the immediate post-loss period. Requests for declassification in the 1970s and 1980s were denied, with officials citing ongoing relevance to submarine operations and design. The Ministry of Defense maintained that releasing technical information about how Affray sank might compromise the security of submarines still in service, even as those submarines incorporated technologies far more advanced than the 1945-era Amphion class. Partial declassification came in 2001, 50 years after the loss. The released documents confirmed the snort mask failure as the official cause, but also revealed the extent of known problems with snort systems across the submarine fleet. The declassified testimony showed that Admiralty officials had been aware of valve failures on other submarines, but had judged the risk acceptable given the advantages of snort technology. This admission raised questions about whether Affray's loss had been a tragic accident or the predictable result of inadequate safety standards. Key documents about the inquiry remain classified even today. Technical drawings of the failed valve system, maintenance records showing what inspections had or had not been conducted on Affray's snort mast, and testimony from witnesses who suggested alternative causes for the sinking have never been released. The Ministry of Defense continues to assert that these materials contain information relevant to current submarine operations, though critics argue that the classification protects institutional reputation rather than genuine security interests. The 75 men who perished aboard HMS Affray included Lieutenant Blackburn, his officers and crew, the 4 Royal Marine officers, and 14 commandos whose families received even less information and submarine crew families due to the classified nature of marine operations. Their deaths prompted reforms in submarine safety that were implemented quietly, without the public acknowledgement that might have provided families with a sense that their loved ones' sacrifices had led to meaningful change. The USS Thresher, April 10th, 1963, 220 miles east of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. The nuclear attack submarine begins deep diving tests under the command of Lieutenant Commander John Wesley Harvey. At 9:17 a.m., the submarine rescue ship USS Skylark receives a garbled message through underwater telephone. Experiencing minor difficulties. Have positive up angle. Attempting to blow. The transmission breaks up, replaced by sounds that Skylark's sonar operators will later describe as a ship breaking apart under immense pressure. Lieutenant Commander Harvey, 36 years old from Jacksonville, Florida, had assumed command of Thresher in January 1963. A 1950 Naval Academy graduate, Harvey had spent his career in submarines and was considered among the Navy's most promising young commanders. His wife Irene and their 3 children lived in Kittery, Maine, close enough to Portsmouth Naval Shipyard that the family could see submarines entering and leaving port. On the morning of April the 10th, Irene Harvey stood at the kitchen window, unaware that her husband was already dead. Thresher was the lead ship of a revolutionary submarine class designed to hunt Soviet submarines in deep water. Launched on July the 9th, 1960, at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, the 278-foot submarine displaced 3,700 tons submerged and could dive deeper than any previous American submarine. Her test depth was classified but exceeded 1,000 feet, with a crush depth calculated at approximately 1,300 feet. The submarine carried Mark 37 torpedoes, subrock anti-submarine missiles with nuclear warheads, and sophisticated sonar systems that represented the cutting edge of Cold War naval technology. The deep diving test on April 10th followed standard procedures for submarines returning to service after major overhauls. Thresher had spent 9 months at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, undergoing maintenance and upgrades, work that included modifications to her propulsion system and weapons handling equipment. The presence of 17 civilian technicians from Portsmouth Naval Shipyard aboard the submarine during the test dive reflected normal practice for post-overhaul trials, bringing the total number aboard to 129 men. At 7:47 a.m., Thresher began her descent from the surface, maintaining communication with Skylark through underwater telephone. The submarine reported reaching depths of 400 feet, then 600 feet, then 800 feet, with each report indicating normal conditions. At 9:02 a.m., Thresher reported she was at test depth and preparing to conduct various drills and equipment tests. The communication was routine, professional, and gave no indication of problems. 9:13 a.m., Thresher reports minor difficulties and begins emergency blow procedures to surface. 9:17 a.m., the final garbled transmission. 9:18 a.m. Skylark's sonar detects sounds consistent with the submarine hull imploding at depth, followed by additional breaking up noises that continue for several minutes. The immediate search focused on the area where Thresher had been diving, but the depth of over 8,000 feet exceeded the capability of rescue submarines and salvage equipment available in 1963. Days turned to weeks as the Navy mobilized deep-sea search assets, finally locating wreckage in late June using the bathyscaphe Trieste. Photographs taken by Trieste showed debris scattered across the ocean floor, with the submarine broken into 6 major sections and thousands of smaller pieces. The Court of Inquiry convened immediately after confirming Thresher's loss. Vice Admiral Bernard Austin presided over proceedings that would hear testimony from submarine designers, nuclear reactor specialists, weapons experts, and survivors of similar incidents on other submarines. Much of the testimony was immediately classified, with separate transcripts maintained for public record and for classified technical discussions. Evidence from the wreckage photographs and acoustic analysis suggested that Thresher had experienced a piping failure that flooded critical spaces with seawater. The most likely scenario involved a silver-brazed pipe joint in the engine room failing under pressure, spraying seawater onto electrical panels and causing reactor shutdown. Without propulsion and with flooding continuing, the submarine would have exceeded crush depth within minutes. The implosion killed everyone aboard instantly, though this fact was carefully communicated to families to spare them from imagining prolonged suffering. The competing theories examined by the inquiry focused on different aspects of the disaster. Some investigators suggested that the emergency ballast blow system had failed due to ice formation in the high-pressure air lines, preventing the submarine from surfacing even after the crew initiated emergency procedures. Others focused on the possibility that multiple systems failed simultaneously, overwhelming the crew's ability to respond. A third group of investigators examined whether design flaws in the Thresher class made the submarines inherently vulnerable to this type of cascade failure. The nuclear reactor's condition at the time of implosion became a matter of intense classified concern. Photographs of the reactor compartment section showed the pressure vessel appeared intact, but radiation monitoring of the area detected elevated levels suggesting some fuel rod damage. The exact radiation readings and their implications for environmental contamination were classified top secret and have never been fully disclosed. The presence of nuclear weapons aboard the submarine added additional classification layers to any discussion of the wreck site. The aftermath of the Thresher disaster led directly to creation of the SubSafe program, a comprehensive submarine safety certification system that continues to this day. Every submarine in the US Navy fleet was required to meet SubSafe standards before being certified for operations. The program addressed known vulnerabilities in piping systems, emergency blow systems, and quality control procedures. However, the specific evidence from Thresher's wreck that drove these reforms remained classified, preventing public understanding of exactly what failures the new standards were designed to prevent. Families of the 129 men who died received different levels of information depending on whether their loved ones were military personnel or civilian technicians. Military families were told that their husbands, fathers, and sons had died in service to their country during classified operations. Civilian technician families faced additional complications as Portsmouth Naval Shipyard struggled to explain why their employees had been aboard a submarine conducting dangerous deep diving tests. Compensation and benefits varied, creating tensions between military and civilian families that persisted for years. The Court of Inquiry's findings were released in two versions. The public report identified piping failure as the likely cause and made general recommendations for improved quality control and emergency systems. The classified report contained detailed technical analysis of exactly which pipe failed, why silver brazed joints were inadequate for deep-diving submarines, how the emergency blow system design was flawed, and what the Navy knew about similar problems on other submarines before Thresher was lost. This classified version remained restricted for decades. Partial declassification occurred in 1993 when the Navy released additional technical details about the piping failure, including photographs showing the type of joints that had failed. Further releases in 2013 provided more information about the emergency blow system problems. However, documents relating to the nuclear reactor's condition, the status of nuclear weapons aboard the submarine, and radiation contamination of the wreck site remain classified. The Navy continues to monitor the wreck area for radiation leaks, but classifies the monitoring data and environmental assessments. The families who lost loved ones aboard Thresher organized memorial efforts and pushed for fuller disclosure of what caused the disaster. Some family members obtained security clearances, allowing them access to classified portions of the investigation, but they were then forbidden from sharing what they learned with other families. This created a situation where some families knew the full truth, while others remained ignorant, bound by classification rules that seemed designed to protect the Navy's reputation rather than legitimate security interests. Recent examination of declassified documents reveals that Navy leadership knew about silver braze joint failures on other submarines before Thresher was lost, but had not implemented fleet-wide fixes. Quality control problems at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard had been documented in internal reports that were never shared with submarine commanders. The decision to conduct deep diving tests with civilian technicians aboard reflected cost-cutting measures that prioritized efficiency over safety. All of these findings were available to investigators in 1963, but were classified to avoid public criticism of Navy leadership. The USS Thresher rests today in pieces on the Atlantic seabed at 41 degrees 44 minutes north latitude, 64 degrees 57 minutes west longitude. Her nuclear reactor remains monitored, her weapons systems gradually corroding in salt water, and her secrets protected by classification stamps that have outlasted most of the officials who applied them. The subsafe program she inspired has prevented similar disasters, but the specific evidence that drove those life-saving reforms stays locked away, accessible only to those with the proper clearances and need to know. Soviet submarine, K-8, April 12, 1970. The Bay of Biscay, 300 miles northwest of Spain. Fire rages through two compartments of the nuclear-powered attack submarine as she surfaces in emergency. Black smoke pouring from the sail, radiation contaminating the vessel. Western naval observers watch from international waters as Soviet rescue ships race toward their stricken submarine. They will witness the sinking, but the Soviet Union will classify every detail about what caused the disaster and what was lost when K-8 went down, carrying 52 men to the seabed. The crisis began 4 days earlier on April 8th, when crew members detected fire in compartment 7, the turbine room aft of the reactor compartment. Captain First Rank Vsevolod Borisovich Besonov ordered immediate firefighting efforts, but the blaze spread rapidly through electrical cables and insulation materials. Within hours, a second fire ignited in compartment 3 forward of the reactor. The submarine, designed to withstand single compartment casualties, faced simultaneous emergencies that overwhelmed damage control capabilities. K-8 was a November-class nuclear attack submarine designated Project 6127A kit by Soviet naval architects. Commissioned in 1960, she was among the first generation of Soviet nuclear submarines and had experienced reactor problems throughout her service life. The submarine had suffered a serious reactor accident in 1960 that killed 8 crew members, an incident the Soviet Navy classified immediately and never publicly acknowledged. Her return to service after that disaster reflected the Soviet Union's desperate need for operational nuclear submarines to counter American naval superiority. Captain Besanov faced impossible choices as the fires burned. The reactor compartment lay between the 2 fire zones, and radiation levels were climbing as cooling systems failed and reactor shielding degraded in the heat. Crew members fighting the fires in Compartment 7 began showing symptoms of radiation sickness within hours. The decision to surface came on April 11th, when Besanov realized that remaining submerged meant certain death for everyone aboard. The submarine's emergency ascent brought her to the surface in waters patrolled by NATO naval forces. American and British warships detected K-8's distress and moved to observe, maintaining careful distance while photographing the stricken Soviet submarine. The images captured by Western intelligence showed crew members on deck wearing makeshift radiation protection, smoke billowing from hatches, and clear evidence of catastrophic damage to the submarine's hull and superstructure. Soviet rescue ships arrived on April 12th, but evacuating crew from a burning radioactive submarine proved enormously difficult. Helicopters lifted some men directly from the deck, while others boarded life rafts in rough seas. Captain Besanov remained aboard with a skeleton crew, attempting to stabilize the submarine for towing. The radiation exposure these men accepted would kill most of them within weeks, though Soviet authorities would never disclose the medical details of their deaths. The 52 crew members who died included men killed directly by the fires, those who succumbed to radiation exposure while fighting to save the submarine, and others who drowned when K-8 finally sank. The official Soviet casualty count, released weeks after the incident, provided no breakdown of how each man died or which crew members had been exposed to lethal radiation doses. Families received notification that their sons or husbands had died in submarine operations, with no additional details provided. April 12, 1970, at approximately 6:01 p.m. local time. K-8 sinks in 4,500 meters of water after Captain Besanov and his remaining crew evacuate to rescue vessels. The submarine goes down with her reactor compartment intact but heavily contaminated, 2 nuclear torpedoes still in their tubes, and classified equipment that the Soviet Navy cannot risk falling into Western hands. The location of the sinking, recorded precisely by American observers, becomes a classified Soviet naval secret. Western intelligence agencies compiled detailed reports on K-8's loss based on their observations and photographic evidence. These reports, classified by NATO authorities, documented the apparent reactor problems, the radiation contamination of crew members, and the Soviet Navy's desperate efforts to prevent Western vessels from approaching too closely. The intelligence value of watching a Soviet nuclear submarine die in real time was enormous, revealing vulnerabilities in Soviet damage control procedures and reactor safety systems. Soviet naval intelligence launched an investigation that remained entirely classified. No public inquiry was conducted. No official findings were released. and surviving crew members were debriefed under strict security protocols that forbade any discussion of the incident. The investigation focused on whether the fires resulted from mechanical failure, poor maintenance, or crew error, but the conclusions were restricted to senior Soviet naval leadership and Communist Party officials. The theories about what caused the initial fires were documented in classified Soviet reports that have never been fully released. Some investigators believed the fire started in the turbine room due to oil leaks and electrical sparks, a common problem in November-class submarines. Others suggested that reactor cooling system failures created conditions where fires became inevitable. A third theory examined whether sabotage played a role, given that the simultaneous fires in separated compartments seemed statistically unlikely. Post-Soviet partial disclosure came in the 1990s when Russian officials acknowledged K-8's loss and confirmed the basic facts of the sinking. However, detailed information about radiation exposure levels, the true casualty count from radiation versus fire versus drowning, and the reactor's condition at the time of sinking remained classified in Russian naval archives. Environmental studies of the wreck site were conducted in the 1990s and 2000s, but the findings were not released publicly. The wreck of K-8 sits today on the Bay of Biscay floor, her reactor compartment monitored periodically by Russian and international observers concerned about potential radiation leaks. The monitoring data, environmental assessments, and technical details about the reactor's current condition are classified by Russian authorities who cite ongoing national security concerns related to nuclear submarine design. The 52 submariners who died aboard K-8 were erased from public memory in the Soviet Union. Their sacrifice classified along with everything about how the submarine caught fire and why the reactor systems failed so catastrophically. Families were forbidden to discuss their losses or to gather publicly to memorialize the dead. The Western photographs showing K-8's final hours remained classified by NATO intelligence agencies, while Soviet authorities denied that Western ships had been anywhere near the sinking. Both sides kept their secrets, protecting not the dead, but the reputation of submarine programs that continued sending men to sea in vessels with known design flaws. USS Guitarro, May 15, 1969. Mare Island Naval Shipyard, Vallejo, California. At 3:00 p.m., the Sturgeon-class nuclear attack submarine still under construction suddenly lists to starboard while moored at the pier. Within minutes, the $100 million vessel sinks in 35 feet of water, flooding with tools, equipment, and classified submarine systems documentation. No one is killed, but the investigation that follows will uncover embarrassing negligence and disturbing questions about sabotage that the Navy immediately classifies. The Guitarro was scheduled for commissioning in January 1970, making the May sinking a catastrophic setback to Navy construction schedules. At 292 feet in length and designed to displace 4,140 tons submerged, she represented the advanced Sturgeon-class design, intended for anti-submarine warfare against Soviet nuclear boats. Her nuclear reactor had not yet been fueled, preventing a radiation disaster, but her compartments contained millions of dollars in sensitive electronics and fire control systems that seawater destroyed instantly. The circumstances of the sinking revealed stunning incompetence. 2 separate work crews, one forward and one aft, had been filling ballast tanks simultaneously without coordinating their activities. The forward crew, employed by the shipyard, was conducting weight compensation tests. The aft crew, civilian contractors installing air conditioning equipment, was filling tanks to level their work platform. Neither group knew what the other was doing. When both tanks filled beyond safe limits, the submarine lost stability and rolled to starboard. Open hatches and ventilation ports allowed water to pour into the submarine's interior spaces once she began listing. Workers scrambled to escape as the vessel settled deeper, but no organized damage control response occurred because no one had authority over the chaotic construction environment. The submarine came to rest on the harbor bottom with her sail and portions of her deck still visible above water, a humiliating spectacle witnessed by workers throughout the shipyard. The initial investigation focused on the obvious culprit: gross negligence by work crews who failed to follow basic safety procedures. Mare Island Naval Shipyard's commanding officer, Captain William Wells, faced immediate questions about supervision and coordination protocols. The investigation documented a construction environment where multiple contractors operated independently, where communication between work crews was minimal, and where safety oversight had been sacrificed to meet aggressive construction deadlines. However, a parallel classified investigation examined darker possibilities. Naval intelligence officers reviewing the incident noted troubling details that suggested deliberate sabotage might have contributed to the sinking. The simultaneous filling of ballast tanks by crews who claimed ignorance of each other's activities seemed statistically suspicious. Security reviews revealed that Mare Island had experienced several penetration attempts by foreign intelligence services during the late 1960s, and background checks on some contract workers showed potential vulnerabilities to recruitment. The sabotage investigation findings were classified top secret and remain so today. What naval intelligence discovered about security failures at Mare Island, whether any workers had connections to foreign intelligence services, and whether the sinking resulted from espionage rather than simple incompetence has never been disclosed. The public narrative of worker error satisfied initial curiosity, while the classified investigation proceeded in complete secrecy. Recovery operations began immediately, with Navy salvage teams pumping water from the submarine's compartments and preparing to refloat the vessel. The process took several weeks and cost an additional $21.8 million beyond the submarine's original construction budget. Every electronic system had to be replaced. All wiring had to be inspected for saltwater damage, and the nuclear reactor compartment required complete recertification before the submarine could be commissioned. USS Guitarro finally entered service in September 1972, more than 3 years behind schedule. Her operational career proceeded without notable incident until her decommissioning in 1992. But the circumstances of her sinking remained a source of embarrassment to the Navy and a cautionary tale about construction management failures. Officers and crew who served aboard Guitarro endured jokes about serving on the submarine that sank at the pier, a distinction no one wanted. The classified investigation's conclusions were never shared with Congress or the public, preventing any accountability for the security failures that may have contributed to the disaster. If foreign intelligence services had successfully penetrated Mare Island's workforce and deliberately caused the sinking, that information was considered too embarrassing to disclose. The Navy's decision to classify the investigation protected institutional reputation rather than legitimate national security interests. Mare Island Naval Shipyard continued submarine construction operations for decades after the Guittaro incident, but the security protocols and worker supervision procedures implemented following the classified investigation remain unknown. The improvements made to prevent future sabotage or espionage, if any occurred, were never acknowledged publicly because doing so would require admitting that sabotage had been a concern in the first place. The Guittaro incident demonstrates how classification serves multiple purposes beyond protecting military technology. In this case, the stamps marked Top Secret protected the Navy from congressional inquiry into security failures, shielded Mare Island's commanding officers from accountability, and prevented public knowledge that foreign intelligence services might have successfully sabotaged a nuclear submarine while it sat at an American pier. June 1st, 1939, Liverpool Bay, England. The brand new submarine HMS Thetis begins sea trials with 103 men aboard, far more than her normal crew complement of 53. At 2 p.m., she dives for torpedo tube testing. At 6 p.m., her stern breaks the surface at a sharp angle. The submarine grounded on the seabed in 160 feet of water, with her bow buried in mud. Rescue ships arrive within hours, but the stern section accessible above water contains no escape hatches. For the next 36 hours, families watch from shore as their husbands, fathers, and sons suffocate inside a steel tube that rescuers can touch but cannot enter. Lieutenant Commander Guy Bolus commanded the trials with a crew that included Camel Laird shipyard workers, Admiralty observers, and Vickers Armstrong technical representatives. The submarine was less than 3 months old, fresh from the builder's yard and undergoing the standard tests required before acceptance into Royal Navy service. The presence of 50 civilians aboard reflected normal practice for contractor sea trials, but it would complicate rescue efforts and intensify public outrage when the disaster unfolded. HMS Thetis was a T-class submarine, part of a new design intended to replace aging O-class and P-class boats. At 275 feet in length and displacing 1,090 tons surfaced, she represented modern submarine technology with improved habitability, better diving characteristics, and enhanced weapon systems. Her torpedo tubes used a new test cock design that allowed crew members to verify whether tubes were flooded before opening the rear doors. This innovation, intended to improve safety, would instead kill 99 men. The test procedure called for checking each of the 6 bow torpedo tubes individually. Leading stoker Walter Arnold opened test cock number 5 and found it dry, indicating the tube was empty and safe to open. When he opened the rear door, the Irish Sea flooded into the submarine at massive pressure. The tube had been flooded all along, but the test cock was blocked with enamel paint from the manufacturing process. Arnold and several other men died instantly in the initial flood. The submarine's bow dropped sharply as tons of water poured in. Lieutenant Commander Bolus ordered emergency surface procedures, but with the bow flooded and heavy, Thetis could only achieve a steep angle with her stern breaking the surface. The submarine came to rest at approximately 18 hours, grounded on a sandbank with 160 feet of water over her bow and her propellers visible above the surface. Passing ships spotted the unusual sight and alerted coastal authorities. Rescue vessels began arriving by 20 hours. What followed was a rescue attempt that became a study in frustration and mechanical failure. The submarine's stern contained no escape hatches, only propeller shafts and rudder mechanisms. Salvage ships attempted to pass air hoses to the submarine, but currents and poor visibility made connection impossible. Divers tried to attach lifting cables, but the submarine's smooth hull provided no good purchase points. Inside, 103 men slowly suffocated as carbon dioxide levels rose. 4 men escaped on June the 2nd using the forward escape hatch after the bow had been underwater for more than 12 hours. Lieutenant Frederick Woods, Captain H.B.K. Oram, leading stoker Arnold's replacement, Frank Shaw, and engine room artificer William Hambrook, surfaced successfully and provided the first detailed account of conditions inside the submarine. Their escape proved that the Davis submerged escape apparatus worked, but no further escapes succeeded before the remaining 99 men died from carbon dioxide poisoning. The public inquiry that followed revealed the catastrophic design flaw in the torpedo tube test cock system. Admiralty engineers had designed the cocks without considering that paint or debris might block the narrow channels, creating false readings that suggested tubes were empty when they were flooded. The inquiry heard testimony about inadequate quality control at Camel Laird Shipyard, poor communication between Admiralty designers and shipyard workers, and the rushed construction schedule that prevented thorough testing of safety systems. However, more damaging findings were classified immediately. Internal Admiralty documents showed that similar test cock problems had been reported on other T-class submarines during construction, but had not been addressed before Thetis went to sea. Budget pressures and the urgent need for new submarines as war approached had led to acceptance of known design flaws. Senior Admiralty officials had signed off on the test cock design despite warnings from engineers that the system was vulnerable to blockage. The public demanded accountability, but the Admiralty faced a dilemma. Britain stood on the brink of war with Germany, and public confidence in the Royal Navy was essential to national morale. Disclosing that the Admiralty had knowingly accepted flawed submarine designs might undermine recruiting, damage naval prestige, and provide propaganda material to Britain's enemies. The most damaging evidence about institutional negligence and systemic failures was quietly classified under regulations that would keep it sealed for decades. The decision to raise, repair, and recommission HMS Thetis shocked families and horrified the public when it became known in 1940. The Admiralty justified the decision on practical grounds. Britain desperately needed submarines, and Thetis was essentially sound except for the design flaw that had been corrected. The submarine was raised in September 1939, thoroughly refitted, her torpedo tube system completely redesigned, and recommissioned as HMS Thunderbolt in December 1940. Lieutenant Commander Cecil Crouch commanded Thunderbolt throughout a successful war career that included Mediterranean patrols and attacks on Axis shipping. The submarine's crew knew about her history as Thetis, but developed their own traditions and identity separate from the tragedy. Thunderbolt's war service included sinking several enemy vessels and conducting covert operations along the Italian coast. For nearly 3 years, the submarine proved that the Admiralty's decision to recommission her had been justified. March 14, 1943. HMS Thunderbolt attacks an Italian convoy off Sicily. The escort vessels counterattack with depth charges, damaging Thunderbolt severely enough that she cannot surface. The submarine sinks in the Mediterranean, with all 64 crew members, none of whom escape. The vessel that had been HMS Thetis claimed a second crew, bringing her total death toll to 163 men across 2 separate disasters. Families of the Thetis victims learned about Thunderbolt's loss and felt their grief reopened by the knowledge that the submarine which had killed their loved ones had been sent back to war. The Admiralty's decision to recommission rather than scrap the vessel seemed vindicated by 3 years of successful operations. But the second loss raised questions about whether the submarine had been truly cursed, or whether structural problems from the 1939 sinking had contributed to her 1943 loss. The documents classified after the Thetis inquiry remained sealed through World War II and beyond, protected by Official Secrets Act provisions and the reluctance of successive Admiralty leadership to acknowledge institutional failures. The families who lost men in 1939 fought for decades to obtain full disclosure of what the inquiry had found. Partial release came in the 1970s, revealing the extent of known problems with the test cock design and the schedule pressures that had led to inadequate safety testing. HMS Thetis stands unique among submarine disasters for claiming 2 separate crews across 2 separate identities. The 99 men who died in Liverpool Bay in 1939 suffocated within sight of rescue ships, killed by a design flaw that Admiralty officials knew about but had not fixed. The 64 men who died aboard Thunderbolt in 1943 perished fighting Britain's enemies, but they died aboard a submarine whose history should have condemned her to the scrapyard rather than war service. The classified documents explaining why the Admiralty made the choices it made remain partially sealed even today, protecting institutional decisions that sent 163 men to their deaths. October 3rd, 1986, 680 miles northeast of Bermuda, a liquid-fuel R-27 missile explodes in its launch tube aboard the Soviet ballistic missile submarine K-2119, flooding the compartment with toxic nitric acid fumes and seawater. The submarine, carrying 15 nuclear-tipped ballistic missiles and 2 nuclear torpedoes, begins an emergency surface while crew members fight to prevent a reactor meltdown that could contaminate the Atlantic. Above the surface, U.S. Navy vessels close in to observe. What follows will be 72 hours of nuclear brinkmanship, heroic sacrifice, and a classification agreement between superpowers. The Soviets will hide their missile failures, and the Americans will hide what they learned by watching. Captain Second Rank Igor Anatolievich Britanov commanded K-2119, a Yankee I-class ballistic missile submarine commissioned in 1972. At 42 years old, Britanov had commanded strategic missile submarines since 1984 and was considered competent by Soviet Pacific Fleet standards. His crew of 119 included experienced missile technicians, reactor specialists, and young conscripts serving their mandatory naval service. Among them was 20-year-old seaman Sergei Anatolievich Preminin from Skryabino, a small village in Velikostyuksky district. Preminin served in the reactor compartment, a posting that required technical skill and absolute reliability. The explosion occurred at 5:14 a.m. local time, when seal failures in Missile Tube 6 allowed seawater to contact the R-27's hypergolic fuel. The resulting chemical reaction generated immense heat and pressure, blowing the missile tube's hatch cover into the ocean and flooding the tube with seawater. Toxic nitric acid vapors spread through the missile compartment, killing 3 crew members instantly and forcing evacuation of the forward sections. Captain Britanoff ordered emergency surface procedures, knowing that remaining submerged meant the submarine would flood completely within minutes. K-219 broke the surface at a steep angle, her bow riding high as water continued pouring into the damaged missile compartment. The explosion had also damaged the submarine's pressure hull, creating flooding in adjacent compartments that threatened the reactor spaces. U.S. Navy P-3 Orion patrol aircraft detected the surfaced Soviet submarine within hours and guided surface vessels to the location. The guided missile cruiser USS Yorktown arrived on October 4th, positioning herself close enough to photograph the damaged Soviet submarine in detail. The immediate crisis focused on the submarine's 2 nuclear reactors. Flooding and fire damage had disrupted cooling systems, creating conditions where reactor meltdown became increasingly likely. Captain Britanoff faced the horrifying possibility that his submarine might become a floating Chernobyl in the middle of the Atlantic shipping lanes. The decision to shut down both reactors manually required crew members to enter contaminated spaces with radiation levels that would deliver lethal doses within minutes. Seaman Preminin volunteered for the shutdown mission, along with Lieutenant Nikolai Belikov. The 2 men entered the reactor compartment wearing minimal protective equipment, working to secure control rods and stabilize the reactors before core temperatures reached meltdown thresholds. Belikov completed his assigned tasks and evacuated, but Preminin remained behind when a hatch jammed, trapping him in the reactor space. He completed the reactor shutdown procedure alone, knowing he would die from radiation exposure. His actions prevented a nuclear catastrophe that would have contaminated Atlantic waters and coastal areas from Bermuda to Europe. The U.S. Navy maintained careful surveillance throughout the crisis. The USS Yorktown photographed the damaged submarine from multiple angles, documenting the blown missile tube hatch, the severe list to starboard, and the desperate efforts of Soviet crew members to stabilize their vessel. American intelligence analysts aboard observation aircraft monitored Soviet radio communications, providing real-time assessment of the crisis to Washington. The intelligence value of watching Soviet damage control procedures and reactor emergency protocols was enormous. Soviet rescue ships arrived on October 5th after steaming at maximum speed from Cuba. The ocean-going tug SB-406 took K-219 under tow, attempting to bring the crippled submarine to Cuban waters where Soviet naval facilities could provide support. Captain Britanoff and a skeleton crew remained aboard despite the radiation hazards and the submarine's precarious stability. The tow proceeded slowly, with American vessels maintaining close surveillance and Soviet commanders growing increasingly anxious about what U.S. intelligence was learning from the incident. October 6, 1986, at 11:03 a.m., the tow line parts and K-219 begins to sink. Captain Britanoff orders evacuation, and the remaining crew transfers to rescue vessels. The submarine goes down in 18,000 feet of water, carrying her nuclear reactors, 15 ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, 2 nuclear torpedoes, and classified communications equipment. The exact position of the sinking is recorded by both American and Soviet observers, but neither side will share the location publicly. The immediate aftermath created unusual diplomatic tensions. The Soviet Union demanded that U.S. vessels cease surveillance and withdraw from the area. The United States refused, asserting the right to monitor a nuclear hazard in international waters. Both sides accused the other of endangering the rescue operations, but neither side disclosed the true reason for the standoff. Each wanted to prevent the other from examining the wreck or salvaging classified materials from the sunken submarine. The investigation conducted by Soviet naval intelligence remained entirely classified. Captain Britanov faced court-martial on charges of losing his submarine, despite his heroic efforts to save the crew and prevent environmental disaster. The court-martial proceedings focused on his decision to surface rather than attempt underwater damage control, ignoring the fact that remaining submerged would have killed everyone aboard. Britanov was found guilty of negligence and dismissed from the Navy, a scapegoat for systemic failures in Soviet missile maintenance and submarine design. Seaman Preminin's sacrifice remained classified by Soviet authorities for years. His family received notification that he had died in a training accident, with no details about his heroism or the nuclear disaster he had prevented. The Soviet Navy could not publicly acknowledge that a ballistic missile submarine had nearly suffered reactor meltdown, so Preminin's actions were classified along with everything else about K211's loss. His posthumous decoration came quietly, without the public recognition that his sacrifice deserved. The United States classified its own observations and intelligence analysis of the K219 incident. The photographs taken by USS Yorktown showing the damaged Soviet submarine were stamped top secret and restricted to personnel with special compartmented information clearances. The acoustic data, communications intercepts, and technical analysis of Soviet damage control procedures all became classified material that provided insights into Soviet submarine vulnerabilities. American intelligence agencies knew exactly what had caused the missile explosion, but chose not to share this information, preserving both intelligence sources and the strategic advantage of understanding Soviet submarine weaknesses. The competing theories about what caused the initial missile explosion were documented in classified reports that both superpowers maintained separately. Soviet investigators believed the explosion resulted from poor maintenance of the R-27 missile's seal systems, a known problem with aging Yankee-class submarines that budget constraints prevented from being fixed fleet-wide. American analysts, working from surveillance data, suggested that collision with the USS Augusta, a Los Angeles-class attack submarine operating in the area, might have jarred the missile tube and caused seal failure. Both theories were classified, preventing any public understanding of whether the disaster resulted from Soviet negligence, American proximity, or simple mechanical failure. Environmental concerns about the wreck have been monitored but never fully disclosed by either nation. K219 sits in 18,000 feet of water with her nuclear reactors, nuclear warheads, and nuclear torpedoes slowly corroding. Russian authorities conducted wreck surveys in the 1990s and 2000s, but classified the findings about radiation leakage and structural deterioration. The United States monitors the site through classified programs that track nuclear contamination in Atlantic waters, but does not share data publicly. A post-Soviet partial disclosure came in the 1990s when Russian veterans organizations campaigned for recognition of Seaman Preminin's heroism. His story finally became public nearly a decade after his death, with Russian authorities acknowledging that he had died preventing reactor meltdown. However, The full details of K219's loss, the extent of the nuclear danger, and the mutual classification agreement between the superpowers remained protected. K219 represents a case where both sides had reasons to classify the same incident for different purposes. The Soviet Union hid catastrophic missile maintenance failures and the near meltdown that would have contaminated the Atlantic. The United States hid its ability to monitor Soviet submarines so closely and the intelligence gained from watching their damage control procedures. Seaman Preminin died a hero whose sacrifice was hidden by authorities who valued institutional secrecy over honoring the dead, while his submarine became a radioactive monument to Cold War priorities that placed military prestige above transparency and environmental safety. August 25, 1949. The Arctic Ocean, 125 miles north of Norway. Freezing fog blankets the surface as the diesel-electric submarine USS Kochino operates on a highly classified surveillance mission against Soviet naval installations. At 8 hours p.m., a massive battery explosion tears through the after-battery compartment, filling the submarine with hydrogen gas and toxic fumes. Commander Rafael Celestino Benitez orders emergency service in mountainous seas. The submarine rescue vessel USS Tusk, operating nearby on the same classified mission, races through the Arctic storm to assist. The next 24 hours will claim 7 lives and force the Navy to classify everything about why American submarines were operating in Soviet waters. Commander Benitez, 40 years old from Key West, Florida, had taken command of Kochino in April 1949, specifically for the classified surveillance operations that would become her final mission. A Naval Academy graduate and experienced submarine officer, Benitez understood the strategic importance of gathering intelligence on Soviet naval bases in the Barents Sea. His crew of 76 included specialists in electronic surveillance, sonar operators trained to identify Soviet submarine signatures, and technicians operating experimental detection equipment that the Navy would never publicly acknowledge existed. USS Kochino was a Palau-class submarine, commissioned in 1945, one of many World War II-era boats modified for Cold War intelligence operations. At 301 feet in length and displacing 1,525 tons surfaced, she carried sophisticated electronic surveillance equipment installed during a classified refit at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. Her modifications included specialized antennas, recording devices for Soviet radio communications, and sonar systems designed to detect the acoustic signatures of Soviet submarines operating from northern bases. The surveillance mission had begun weeks earlier when Kochino and Tusk departed from classified forward operating locations to conduct coordinated intelligence gathering off the Soviet coast. The exact nature of their mission remained so highly classified that even decades later, Navy officials would refuse to disclose specific operational details. The submarines operated close enough to Soviet territorial waters to intercept communications, photograph naval facilities through periscope, and map Soviet submarine patrol routes. The battery explosion resulted from hydrogen gas buildup in the after-battery compartment, a known hazard in diesel-electric submarines that required constant ventilation and monitoring. The blast killed electrician's mate Robert Wellington Philo instantly and started fires that spread through electrical cables and insulation. The submarine's emergency surface brought her into Arctic storm conditions, with winds exceeding 50 knots and waves reaching 20 feet. USS Tusk arrived within hours, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Robert Worthington, The rescue attempt proceeded in conditions that made any crew transfer extraordinarily dangerous. Tusk maneuvered alongside Cochino repeatedly, attempting to pass fire hoses and rescue equipment, while both submarines pitched violently in the storm. During one approach, a large wave swept 6 Tusk crew members overboard. Chief Petty Officer William Mazzone, Boatswain's Mate Second Class John Whitaker, Fireman Eugene Hoffman, Seaman Richard Fillion, Seaman John Johnson, and Seaman Norman Lindblom died in Arctic waters before rescue swimmers could reach them. The classified surveillance mission created complications for rescue operations that persisted even as men were dying. Both submarines carried equipment and documents that could not be allowed to fall into Soviet hands. Commander Benitez spent critical hours ensuring that classified materials were secured or destroyed before abandoning Cochino. The priority given to protecting surveillance equipment may have cost lives, but Navy regulations left no discretion about classified material security. August 26, 1949, at 7:00 p.m. Commander Benitez orders Cochino abandoned after fires reignite and threaten the torpedo room. The crew transfers to Tusk in nightmarish conditions, with men jumping between submarines as waves crashed over both vessels. Cochino sinks at 8:54 p.m. in approximately 600 feet of water, taking her surveillance equipment and mission records to the Arctic seabed. The exact location of the sinking is classified immediately. The investigation into Cochino's loss proceeded under the strictest secrecy protocols. The Court of Inquiry heard classified testimony about the surveillance mission, the modifications made to Cochino for intelligence operations, and the experimental equipment aboard the submarine. The battery explosion's cause was documented as hydrogen gas ignition, but the inquiry also examined whether Soviet detection and countermeasures might have contributed to conditions leading to the disaster. Navy officials classified all mission details, operational orders, and intelligence gathered during Cochino's final patrol. Crew members who survived were debriefed under security protocols that forbade any discussion of where they had been or what they had been doing. The families of the 7 men who died received notification that their loved ones had perished in submarine operations, with no mention of Arctic surveillance or intelligence missions against Soviet installations. The Tusk crew members who died attempting rescue became casualties of a mission they had not been briefed on and operations they could not discuss, even if they had survived. Their families were told about a training accident in northern waters, a story that satisfied initial questions but left permanent gaps in understanding why their sons and husbands had been risking their lives in Arctic storms. Partial declassification came in the 1990s when the Navy acknowledged that Cochino had been conducting electronic surveillance operations against Soviet naval bases. However, specific details about what the submarine discovered, what surveillance techniques were employed, and what intelligence was lost when Cochino sank remained classified. The mission reports, if they survived in Tusk's files, stayed locked in Navy archives. The 7 men who died in Arctic waters became early casualties of Cold War submarine espionage, a conflict waged in absolute secrecy beneath polar ice and along hostile coastlines. Electricians made Philo died in the explosion that crippled Cochino, while Chief Mazzone and his 5 Tusk shipmates drowned trying to save fellow submariners during a mission that officially did not exist. Their sacrifice remained classified for nearly 50 years honored privately within the submarine community, but hidden from families who deserved to know that their loved ones had died gathering intelligence that shaped American Cold War strategy. Soviet submarine K-27. May 24th, 1968. The Arctic Ocean off Novaya Zemlya. The experimental liquid metal-cooled reactor aboard the Project 645 submarine experiences catastrophic cooling system failure, flooding engineering spaces with radiation that kills 9 crew members within days and contaminates the entire vessel. Captain First Rank Valentin Petrovich Terichenko faces a choice between revealing the complete failure of the Soviet Union's advanced reactor program or hiding the disaster forever beneath Arctic waters. The decision has already been made by authorities in Moscow. K-27 will be decommissioned quietly, her crew forbidden to speak, and eventually she will be scuttled with her reactor still loaded with nuclear fuel. K-27 represented Soviet ambitions to surpass American nuclear submarine technology through radical innovation. The submarine was powered by 2 VT-1 liquid metal-cooled reactors using a lead bismuth eutectic coolant instead of the pressurized water systems used in conventional naval reactors. The theoretical advantages were significant: higher power density, better efficiency, and improved performance characteristics. The practical reality proved disastrous. The VT-1 reactors were temperamental, required constant maintenance, and suffered from coolant chemistry problems that caused corrosion throughout the reactor systems. The submarine had experienced reactor problems since her commissioning in 1963. Multiple minor incidents involving coolant leaks and cooling system malfunctions had been documented in classified maintenance reports, but never resulted in comprehensive fixes. Soviet naval leadership, committed to demonstrating that liquid metal reactor technology could compete with American pressurized water designs, ordered K-27 to continue operations despite growing evidence that the VT-1 system was fundamentally flawed. The May 24th emergency began when operators detected loss of coolant circulation in the port reactor. The liquid metal coolant, which remained liquid at higher temperatures than water, but solidified at relatively modest cooling, began to freeze in sections of the cooling loop. Attempts to restore circulation failed, and reactor temperatures climbed rapidly. Radiation alarms throughout the engineering spaces indicated that reactor shielding had been compromised and that the crew was being exposed to lethal doses. The 9 men who died of acute radiation syndrome included engineering specialists who had spent years working with the experimental reactors. Their deaths unfolded over days and weeks as radiation destroyed their bone marrow and organ systems. Soviet medical authorities treating the victims classified their case files immediately, preventing any disclosure of how the VT-1 reactor failure had created conditions for such catastrophic radiation exposure. Captain Terichenko brought K-27 back to port, but the submarine was so contaminated that normal decommissioning procedures were impossible. Radiation levels in the reactor compartment exceeded safe limits by factors of thousands. The decision to decommission the submarine came quickly, but determining what to do with a radioactive hulk containing 2 nuclear reactors proved more difficult. Dismantling the reactors would require exposing additional workers to dangerous radiation. Storing the submarine at a naval facility created ongoing contamination risks. The Soviet Navy chose the expedient solution: keep K-27 moored at a remote location, conduct minimal monitoring, and hope the problem would resolve itself. The submarine remained at Gromyka Naval Base for over a decade, slowly corroding while her reactors remained loaded with nuclear fuel. Workers at the base avoided the contaminated vessel, and security protocols prevented any discussion of why a seemingly intact submarine sat abandoned at the pier. September 6, 1982. Soviet authorities decided to scuttle K-27 in the Kara Sea, disposing of the radioactive submarine by sinking her in 108 feet of water in Stepovago Fjord. The decision violated international agreements on nuclear waste disposal and created a long-term environmental hazard. But Soviet authorities judged that the risk of maintaining K-27 at a naval facility exceeded the risks of dumping her in Arctic waters. The scuttling was conducted in secrecy, with no international notification and no environmental impact assessment. The investigation into K-27's reactor failure remained entirely classified. Soviet naval engineers documented the cooling system design flaws, the metallurgical problems with reactor components exposed to liquid metal coolant, and the operational challenges that made the VT-1 system unsuitable for submarine applications. However, these findings were restricted to personnel with special clearances in the Soviet nuclear submarine program. The broader Soviet military establishment never learned why the liquid metal reactor program had failed or why K-27 had been scuttled rather than properly decommissioned. Post-Soviet environmental monitoring has detected radiation leakage from K-27's corroding hull, but Russian authorities continue to classify detailed assessments of the contamination. Norwegian environmental organizations have protested the presence of nuclear submarines dumped in the Kara Sea, but Russian naval authorities refuse to provide comprehensive information about radiation levels or plans for eventual recovery of the reactors. The 9 submariners who died of radiation poisoning became non-persons in Soviet records, their sacrifice erased, along with the evidence of the reactor program's failure. Their families received minimal information about the cause of death, and medical records showing the progression of their radiation sickness were classified to prevent any understanding of how dangerous the VT-1 reactors had been. K-27 sits today in shallow Arctic waters, her experimental reactors corroding and leaking radiation into the marine environment. Russian authorities monitor the site, but classify the monitoring data, environmental threat assessments, and any discussion of eventual reactor recovery. The submarine represents an ongoing environmental disaster that authorities prefer to keep hidden rather than address, while the classified documents about the VT-1 reactor failure remain sealed, protecting not national security, but the reputation of Soviet engineering programs that sent men to work with fundamentally flawed technology. May 23, 1939, 10 miles off the Isles of Shoals, New Hampshire. The submarine USS Squalus begins a test dive with 59 men aboard, her crew conducting the standard trials required before final acceptance by the US Navy. At 8:40 a.m., Lieutenant Oliver Francis Nequin orders the dive. At 8:45 a.m., the main induction valve fails to close completely, allowing seawater to flood the engine rooms at catastrophic pressure. Squalus plunges out of control to 243 feet, coming to rest on the ocean floor with her forward compartments intact and 33 men alive, while 26 crew members drown in the flooded aft sections. The rescue that follows will be miraculous, but the investigation into why a brand new submarine nearly killed everyone aboard will be buried in classified files that remain partially sealed 8 decades later. Lieutenant Naquin, 36 years old, from Chicago, had taken command of Squalus only weeks before the fatal dive. An experienced submarine officer with a reputation for careful adherence to procedures, Naquin had no reason to suspect that his new command suffered from a fundamental design flaw that made the main induction valve vulnerable to failure. His training had taught him to trust the valve position indicators in the control room, instruments that showed the valve fully closed when in reality a hydraulic malfunction had left it partially open. The submarine was among the newest in the fleet, launched on September 14, 1938, at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard. The Squalus-class design, later renamed Sargo-class, incorporated improvements over earlier submarines, including better habitability, more powerful diesel engines, and enhanced diving characteristics. At 310 feet in length and displacing some 450 tons surfaced, Squalus represented American submarine technology at the cusp of World War II. Her construction had proceeded on an accelerated schedule driven by tensions in Europe and the Pacific, schedule pressures that may have compromised quality control procedures. The 26 men who died in the flooded compartments included experienced enginemen and electricians trapped when seawater burst through the open main induction valve. Chief Machinist's mate Lloyd Maness died at his station in the engine room, along with Machinist's mate First Class John Battick and 24 other crew members who had no time to escape before the compartments flooded completely. Their deaths were nearly instantaneous as pressure equalized and the aft sections filled. The 33 survivors in the forward compartments faced their own nightmare. The submarine rested at an angle on the seabed with limited battery power and air that would become unbreathable within hours. Lieutenant Naquin organized the men, instituted CO2 absorption procedures using chemicals aboard the submarine, and prepared to use the newly developed McCann rescue chamber if rescue ships arrived in time. The crew's discipline and Naquin's leadership would save lives, but the hours of waiting on the dark seabed tested every man's courage. The rescue operation employed the McCann rescue chamber for the first time in actual emergency conditions. The diving bell, developed after previous submarine disasters, could mate with the submarine's escape hatch and transport men to the surface in groups. Over the course of May 24th, the chamber made 4 trips to Squalus, bringing all 33 survivors safely to the surface. The successful rescue validated years of development work and provided families with the miracle of seeing loved ones they had feared lost. The investigation began immediately, with Navy officials determined to understand why a submarine, less than a year old, had suffered such catastrophic failure. The Board of Inquiry examined the main induction valve mechanism in detail, conducting tests on identical valves aboard sister ships. The investigation found that hydraulic pressure variations could cause the valve operating mechanism to indicate fully closed when the valve remained partially open. This design flaw affected the entire class of submarines under construction. However, broader findings about the rushed construction schedule, inadequate quality control testing, and systemic problems in the submarine construction program were classified to avoid undermining public confidence in the Navy's expanding submarine fleet. With war approaching, authorities judged that disclosure of widespread submarine design and construction problems might damage recruiting, alarm the families of submariners, and provide intelligence to potential enemies about American submarine vulnerabilities. The decision to salvage and recommission Squalus came quickly despite the tragedy associated with the submarine. The Navy needed every available submarine, and Squalus was essentially sound except for the corrected valve problem. The salvage operation took months, requiring multiple dives and the installation of patches and pumps to bring the submarine to the surface. In September 1939, Squalus was raised, towed to Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, and completely refitted. USS Sailfish, as the submarine was renamed, commissioned on May 15, 1940, with a new crew and the psychological burden of her history. The sailors who served aboard Sailfish knew they were sailing a ship where 26 men had died, but they developed their own traditions and identity. During World War II, Sailfish compiled an impressive combat record, sinking several Japanese vessels and conducting successful war patrols in the Pacific. The families of the 26 men who died accepted the Navy's explanation that a mechanical failure had caused the disaster. The successful rescue of 33 survivors and the pioneering use of the McCann rescue chamber created a narrative of technological triumph over tragedy. Questions about why the valve had failed and whether the disaster was preventable were satisfied by the Navy's assurances that the problem had been fixed and that future submarines would be safe. The classified documents about Squalus's loss remained restricted through World War II and beyond. The investigation findings about construction quality control, the systemic nature of the valve problem across multiple submarines, and the schedule pressures that led to inadequate testing were protected under regulations that cited both national security and the need to maintain confidence in Navy shipbuilding programs. Partial declassification came decades later when historians and submarine veterans organizations pushed for fuller disclosure. The released documents confirmed the hydraulic valve failure mechanism and acknowledged that similar problems had been found on other submarines. However, materials relating to how many other boats were affected, what near misses occurred on other vessels, and what Navy leadership knew about the risks before Squalus's loss remained classified. USS Sailfish was decommissioned in 1945 after successful war service that validated the Navy's decision to salvage and recommission the submarine. The combat record earned by Sailfish's wartime crews helped obscure questions about whether Squalus should have been lost in the first place. The redemption narrative satisfied a public that needed to believe in the Navy's submarine program as World War II approached and raged, while the classified truth about preventable design flaws and construction failures stayed locked in Navy archives, protecting institutional reputations built on the graves of 26 men who died testing a submarine that should never have been sent to sea with known vulnerabilities. French submarine Minerve, January 27, 1968, the Mediterranean Sea, 30 miles south of Toulon, France. At 7:55 a.m., the Daphne-class diesel-electric submarine transmits her final position report after completing a training exercise, preparing to return to port. At 8:04 a.m., shore stations detect underwater acoustic signals consistent with a submarine breaking apart under pressure. Then silence. The French Navy searches for weeks, but finds nothing. For 51 years, Minerve remains lost, and the French government's investigation remains classified. When the wreck is finally discovered in July 2019, new questions emerge about